Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Economics Class. Today we're going to talk about the business cycle, the way that the stock market and the economy in general tend to go up and down in a fairly predictable pattern, which sometimes the cycle takes 20 years to go through. Other times it may happen in a much shorter period of time, but it is just kind of, at this point, it appears that that is just a natural law of economics. The way that the business cycle is going to come, although we've managed to figure out some ways to affect the length of the business cycle. But so before we get into explaining that, we want to lay down some term introductions about some ways that we actually are able to measure economic productivity as a nation, to measure the economy. And the best and most common measurement of the health of the economy is what they call GDP, gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is basically the sum total of all the goods and services that are produced in a nation within a time period. And the formula for how they figure GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So what does that mean? So first off, consumption. Everything that consumers spend on durable goods, non-durable goods, or services, which, to illustrate the difference between those things, you drive to the movies in your car, which is a durable good. You buy popcorn and eat it, which is a non-durable good, meaning it doesn't last forever. Durable goods last longer. And then you receive the service of being shown the movie, which is not something that you own after the fact. So but it's a service that's rendered to you. They'll put it up on the screen and you can watch it. So all three of those things, durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, qualify as part of consumption. To consumption, they add investment. That is what businesses spend on increasing their capital. And that can be in the form of new business supplies, like a factory, like a farm buying a new tractor. Or it can be as related to unused inventory, like like a store buying 20 of something and they only sell 10 of them. That still factors into their investment total because they invested the money there. So consumption plus investment plus government spending. That is everything that the not just the national but also the state and local governments have added in terms of purchasing goods and services, with the exception of transfer payments. So they don't count sending out Social Security checks or welfare checks or whatever toward the GDP calculation. And then the last thing are net exports, which factors into foreign trade. So net exports are how much more money we make on exports than we make on imports. There may be some years where we have what they call a negative trade balance, where we've actually bought more imports than we've sold exports. So this may be a negative number in some years. It's not really that big of a deal. People make a big deal about the idea of a trade imbalance, but on paper, me and Bilo have a really bad trade imbalance, right? They haven't. They make a profit every time I go in there. So on paper, we've got a negative trade balance, but at the same time, I got the goods that I asked for. So it's not always a bad deal, like some people make it out to be. However, for the sake of calculating GDP, this is going to be your exports minus your imports. So they add those four things together, and the number that they come up with is the gross domestic product, the GDP, which is the measurement of how much the country has produced in terms of goods and services. And when the GDP is expanding, that means that's what we call economic growth. And if GDP is shrinking, that's what we're going to call economic contraction. One thing that is very important to understand about economics is that it is not a zero-sum game, meaning you'll hear people, especially on the political left, will talk a lot about, although now you're starting to hear it on the right as well, from certain factions. But you'll hear a lot of people talk about the problem of this group of people, that group, don't have a big enough piece of the pie, right? And the concept that they when they say that, when they say, factory workers don't have enough of the pie compared to owners, but the idea is there's a certain amount of money that is there that has to be distributed amongst people. That there's a set amount of productivity in the country, but the reality is that the productivity of the country can change. It can shrink, but it also can grow. And so it is possible for everyone to get richer. And in fact, is basically what has happened over the last, if you look at what the average person had in terms of personal income and what they needed 100 years ago to today, it's pretty much across the board improvement. People will complain, well, income inequality has risen. Yes, a little bit, but at the same time, the 5% at the bottom are doing better than the 5% at the bottom 100 years ago. The 5% at the top are doing better than the 5% at the top 100 years ago. So typically the trend has been over the last 100 years has been for the whole world to get richer. In fact, we just really global poverty had a tremendous decrease by any measurable statistic in the last 10 to 12 years. Obviously, some of the worldwide recession that's happening right now with the virus, we'll see if some of those gains get wiped out, but that's kind of the place that we were in even just a few months ago. But in general, the economy can grow, and it can grow, and it can grow. And so, and in fact, the reality is economic health kind of requires a certain amount of growth. A stagnating economy is going to lead to more people in poverty. If you have an economy that's not growing, it's going to be hard to do anything for the unemployed, and it's going to be hard to do anything. It's better. It really is better for everyone if there's widespread economic growth, even the poor, because there's more resources with which to take care of them in a booming economy. So, there's two types of GDP. There's nominal GDP, which is the GDP as it's measured in the numbers that were being used at the year that it was taken. And then there is real GDP, which is adjusted for inflation or adjusted for the relative purchasing power of the dollar in a given year. And real GDP is what you need to work with if you're doing any kind of measurement of comparing GDP now to the 1970s, because or some other time period, because back then everything was cheaper, which also meant everyone's salary looked lower, but it's possible for people's salary to have gone up and not actually kept up with inflation. So real GDP measures inflation in there as well, so that you can really compare how much purchasing power an ordinary American had in a given year, or how much productivity, more specifically, per capita would be per person. But in general, the GDP, how productive the country was, based on a common measurement of purchasing power. A couple things that are not included in that GDP number, because remember, statistics are only as valuable as the numbers you put into them. So there are some services that aren't covered. So any kind of black market stuff is not covered in GDP. If people are working under the table, that's not going to show up in the GDP figures. Services that are done for free aren't going to show up in GDP. So, for instance, a housewife on any given day is going to render 100 services that other people would charge for, whether it's being a laundromat or being a cook or doing cleaning services, but they don't get paid for it, typically. So. So that's not going to factor into a GDP number. And the other thing is GDP, generally a country with a high GDP is going to have a high quality of life. However, and a country with a low GDP is going to have a lower quality of life and comfort level. However, you do have to keep in mind that GDP is a nationwide instrument, and so therefore it doesn't really measure the distribution. So you do have some countries like America have a thriving middle class, and people generally do pretty well. But then there's some other countries like the so-called banana republics in Central America where the GDP numbers might be deceiving because, you may have a decent looking number, but all the ownership is coalesced in a very small amount of people. So a country can be poor in reality and their GDP be a little deceptive, if it's one of these countries with extraordinary income inequality. There's a couple other nationwide economic measures. We don't need to, we're trying to cram in the rest of the book in 2 weeks. So we don't need to go into all those. I will say gross national product, or GNP, is the market value of all the final goods and services that's produced. So, for instance, the difference between a final good and what's not a final good is this shirt right here is a final good, but the cotton that was sold to make it is not a final good. So a final good is something that's actually it's not made for investment, it's made for the consumption level. And so the GNP is the measure of that number of the final goods and services. And personal income is the income received by a country's people from all sources. So that would add in things like Social Security, unemployment, welfare benefits, stuff like that, to kind of figure out how much purchasing power an ordinary person has. So with those being that, lighting the foundation for what kind of measurements you have for how the economy is doing, now let's look about what exactly it means for the economy to be up and down. What are the things that cause GDP and GNP and personal income and these other factors to collapse and to rise? There's just something, it's just a law of mathematics that just cannot seem to be tamed, the idea of the law of the business cycle. That is, it's a series of growing and shrinking periods of economic activity measured by increases and decreases in real GDP. So when people say we're in a recession, that's basically a reference to how many months in a row GDP has declined. So economic growth is defined as an expansion of GDP, and the first part of the business cycle is a period known as expansion. When you're in an expansion period, people want new goods and services. So because there's demand, people are trying to raise the supply to meet that demand, and so they need labor. So typically there's high employment, there's lots of investment, money's flowing around. It's, a lot of times it's easy to get loans, and in general, people are having money. And you can see how a lot of these factors are really kind of connected. So, and because when one of these things starts to go downward, it starts to ripple through the market in quite crazy ways. But at an expansion period of time, things are building up. It's easy to get hired. It's easy to find work. Wages are rising. And things are doing well. Well, then you hit the peak. The peak is the point where real GDP is the highest at the business cycle. And you never know what the peak was until you've come back through the cycle again. So you may think you're hitting a peak and then be surprised to find it skyrocket again. You only know what the peak was with hindsight. But what happens at the peak, excuse me, my nose is itching me to death, I'm sorry. As prices rise and resources tighten, businesses start to become less profitable. And from that point on, things start going downhill. So after the peak, you have the period known as contraction. And contraction is where people start to cut back. Resources become less scarce because production has been so high that there's now a high supply. And so now prices are going down, and so there's a little less profit. So let's say that you work construction, and during the expansion phase, people were buying houses left and right. So the housing industry was like, well, we need to raise the level of supply to meet this rising demand. Well, now we've made too many houses, and now housing prices are going down because there's a glut. So what's going to happen is, people that would be trying to, build developments, now they're not going to start making more houses because they can't sell the ones they have, which means that the construction crew that frames the house and puts everything in, they're going to have less work to do, right? And so, and these construction crews drive a lot of the sales of hardware stores. So the sales are going to go down at the hardware store. So you can see how things will start to ripple about. And so Because employers have less need to produce, they hire fewer people, which means unemployment goes up. Well, guess what? If unemployment jumps up dramatically, which obviously we're living through this right now, where we've had literally tens of millions of people have lost their jobs on either temporary or permanent basis in the last 2 months because they haven't been able to work. Well, because of that, the problem is if you lose your job, you have less money to spend. So you own a store. And let's say that you didn't get affected too much by the shutdown. You were able to continue. Your business was able to continue operating. But guess what? People still aren't gonna be buying as much as they don't have as much money to go spend on stuff. So obviously, people are gonna buy food because they need food, but other things, maybe some of these stores that like just opened back up that are that sell furniture and stuff like that. They're going to deal with the fact that about 20% of the people that would have been selling to no longer have money to go buy furniture. So their sales are going to be down more than likely. So, that's the problem when you get into this contraction phase of the economy is it starts to affect everything because when unemployment is high, there's fewer, consumer spending starts to go down because people don't have money to spend. Unless you do, what we have tried to done in this thing is kind of try to prop it up by throwing money at people, which, is in the short run was probably the smart thing to do in this case, because we figure this is a short-term crisis that'll work itself out. But at the same time, in doing that, we've raised up national debt, which at some point is going to cause inflation, right? So anytime contraction happens, bad things happen in multiple facets of the market. So if you have 2 or more quarters, meaning 6 months or more of economic contraction, meaning GDP is going downhill, then what that leads to is that becomes known as a recession. And so a recession is a period of time that's typically marked by high unemployment, low spending, low productivity, often low investment. And typically during a recession, you'll have limited inflation. However, there can't, because people don't want to raise prices when, you don't want to be jacking up prices as people are going broke because that diminishes the demand for your product. However, sometimes, especially if government policy mishandles some of this stuff, you can have inflation in the midst of the recession. It doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's crippling. And this phenomenon is known as stagflation, which is where you've got inflation married to a stagnant economy. And this happened in the United States in the 1970s and was largely responsible for Gerald Ford losing to Jimmy Carter and then Jimmy Carter losing to Ronald Reagan because no one could really do anything about this whole stagflation situation until the Gipper got in there, bless God. I'm generally not in favor of dictatorship, but if we could raise him from the dead, then I'd think about it, right? And of course, obviously, I always make the point that the economy is not so dependent on one man. You have to really look at why the economy went up or down, and not just blame it on or credit the president. But in this case, Reagan did actually do particular things in terms of tax cuts, and it wasn't just Reagan. It was also Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, did some things that were unpopular at the time, but really kind of helped the situation out. So anyway, contraction though is this period where things are going down, and the last phase of the business cycle is what they call the trough. And so that is the point where the real GDP and employment stop declining, and then once the decline stops, it starts again. And so it stops declining, and so then it starts expanding, and before you know it, you'll hit another peak, and then and so on. So this is kind of the way the business cycle works. If a recession is severe enough and lasts long enough, it gets the title of a depression. And, typically they want to reserve the word depression for when it's been an extended period of time. And, of course, obviously the worst depression we had was the so-called Great Depression of the 1930s, where, it was this perfect storm of stock markets crashing, banks closing up, which meant there was no credit available, and then combine that, you have famine because of the Dust Bowl and things like that, and then the same, and all this time, people, put in a stupid tariff thinking what we really need to do is prop up American business, and that shut down all of our foreign trade, so we had no customers, which caused, the economy of Europe to crater, which allowed Mussolini and Hitler to take over Italy and Germany, I mean. So, Great Depression was just terrible. But you see how all these things build up. When you're in the Great Depression, you can't charge but so much for things. So you can't make but so much profit. Even if your business was still rolling, when you've got this many people unemployed, and there's, this little demand for luxury goods and stuff like that. Because when money, when the economy gets tight, the things that are still keep making money are, really necessary things. It's people that make their money off of wants are the ones that are really going to struggle. Like when we come out of this whole Corona thing, grocery stores are doing fine, I think, for the most part. But you're going to have a lot of people, not having the money to, go to the movies or things like that they would have done flippantly before. Now they had, even if they got their job back, because their company got a small business loan or something before Pelosi shut it down. They still, went, a period of time without a paycheck and so on. So, people are going to be probably pretty tight with their money for a long time, when you come out of this. I mean, there's certainly, I certainly spent a lot less money this month than I, would in a typical month, because you're not going out all the time and just saying, let me go to this restaurant or let me go to the movies or, all the just little random things that you wind up doing, So, aggregate demand is the name given to all the demand of the whole economy. Aggregate supply is the term given to all the supply in the whole economy. And just like when you're analyzing an individual market, you want the demand and supply to meet equilibrium. You want the aggregate supply and aggregate demand to meet what they call macroeconomic equilibrium, which is where that number comes into balance. You'll notice that if you look on page 360 in your book, you'll notice that some of the aggregate supply and demand curves follow slightly different shapes than the supply and demand curves in an ordinary, more specific thing, trying to figure out the equilibrium price for a product. All right, so business cycles. So why do business cycles occur? There's four main factors. One is business decisions. Two is changes in interest rates. Three is consumer expectations. And four is external issues. So the first one, business decisions. The decisions that businesses make have a big impact on everybody, because if you make a decision to start putting your company's eggs in this basket, and then the market goes in another direction, and the company starts losing a lot of money, you're going to have to start laying people off, that kind of a thing. The fourth issue, external issues, is what we're dealing with now as the origin point of the economic problems we've been having in the last month or two. Because 2 months ago, our economy was in one of the best shapes it's ever been in. And then, obviously, we've had a dramatic reversal with the whole coronavirus deal. Well, that's kind of an external situation that came in and made a big impact. World War II made a big impact, although that actually wound up helping in a weird way, because we were coming out of the Great Depression, and it actually was good for the economy to need to hire, for the government to hire all these soldiers and everything, and start, ramping up bomb production and all this kind of stuff. So, but that's a factor, even though that wound up being kind of a positive. That was a factor. Any kind of crisis, anytime there's any kind of conflict in the Middle East, oil prices are typically going to go up, because people don't know if oil reserves are going to get affected by this. There'll be a shortage or what have you. So external things like that, a hurricane coming and taking out, part of the when I was your age. God, I feel old saying that, but when I was your age, gasoline was pushing $4 a gallon. Now, I just got it for $1.50 the other day. I never thought I'd see that again in my life. But part of that was that Hurricane Katrina came through and took out a lot of the stuff, the drilling and stuff in Louisiana and places like that, Texas. And so that drove up the price, because there was more of a shortage, combined with the fact that The Middle East was a hotbed at that time because you had wars going on in Iraq, and Iran was kind of had some stability issues and so on. So all of that conspired, to cause a really high. And of course, at that time, we had not yet kind of improved the American oil industry with fracking and stuff like that. So the reason I bring this up and went a little out of order, starting with external issues, is one thing that's vital to the business decision part is the so-called demand slump. And the oil industry right now and the turmoil that it's been in, where with oil futures going into the negative for the first time in forever, some of that is because of a huge demand slump for oil. Now, a lot of this is, accidental because of the coronavirus thing. But right now, part of the reason, there's some Russian Saudi politics going on involved with it too, but part of the reason why gas is so cheap right now, where you can go fill up for less than $1.50, is because there's no demand. Nobody's driving, right? So if you look at how much, I've spent like $25 on gas this month. I used to spend that in like a couple of weeks. So, if you think about how many times I'd have filled up if we had just continued my routine, I'd have had, 5 trips back and forth to work every week, 2 trips to church back and forth every week. At some point in the week, I'm going to go to Batesburg and go get something to eat or get groceries at Walmart. Over the course of a month, there's probably going to be 3 times probably that I'm going to, either go out of state, visit family, or go to a concert in Charlotte or Columbia or Atlanta or something. So, that's just a whole bunch of stuff I've been doing. Well, I've had, periods of 3 and 4 days at a time where I haven't left my house, right? So I'm buying a lot less gasoline. Well, I'm not the only one. There's hundreds of other people in the same boat. So people just don't need gas, so they're not buying it. And of course, if you're a country like Saudi Arabia or a state like Texas, where your economy has largely been built around the fact that people are always going to need gas to get around, and no one's trying to get around, you're going to be in a little bit of a hurt. But a demand slump can also come from just natural things. So there's an example in your textbook of like when digital music started to replace CDs as the primary way that the record companies sold it. There was this huge downfall in demand for CDs, so that means the plants that made them stopped getting work, so they had to lay off workers, right? So there's a whole bunch. So just the decision of saying we're going to move our distribution from this to that is going to cut out a lot of people that were involved in the old method of distribution. Now, it's also going to create some jobs, in this case, people who would digitize files and stuff like that. But a slump in demand for a product can cause a lot of people to be affected. We talked about the slump in demand for housing is going to have a huge impact on construction crews. So, so businesses' decisions, whether can have a big impact on this stuff. Whether it's a slump in demand. Another thing, them coming out with like a new technology, for instance, might fuel growth. So, like, growth may really come if you develop when you develop a new technology. Like for instance, the smartphone turned the telephone industry upside down. Just tremendous growth. People were buying, phones for the kids, not because the kids really want a phone per se, because they want to have a handheld computer that happens to make phone calls, right? So they're able to grow because they've come up with new products that create new demand, and now you've got stores like you never could have had a telephone repair store 20 years ago because people telephones were cheap. You only used it for making phone calls. They didn't break very often. They sat there on the thing. You'd have to pick them up when someone called you. The whole deal. They just were there. The phone was there in the kitchen. Maybe it was cordless, but it still had a base. Now the telephone is a different thing because of the development of smartphone technology. So now there's this whole little industry of companies that exist to make phone chargers and phone cases and this and that. You never would have had that if you hadn't had the invention of the cell phone and then especially the smartphone. So we've talked about external issues. We've talked about business decisions. A major factor is the changes in interest rates, the availability of interest, the ability to get a loan. If no one can get loans, they're not going to be able to start businesses. So this is going to cause some problems. when interest rates are low and it's easy to get a loan, you're going to have a lot of people starting things up. They're going to start projects, and starting those projects is going to enable people to get work. When interest rates are high, it's going to be difficult to have any sort of startup growth. The problem is sometimes you have to have interest rates high because to have a certain effect on inflation. So we'll talk about that later. Housing is a market that's very dependent on interest rates. And then another thing is consumer expectations. Every year, every month, there's a big survey taken called the Consumer Confidence Survey, and they poll consumers and kind of ask them what they think the state of the economy is and how well they think they're going to be doing in the next few months. Why do they do that? Because consumer confidence can cause recessions or improvements to happen, because people make decisions a lot of times based on what could happen. So I was hitting myself in the face last month because I got to the end of the month and I had a lot less money than I expected to have, and I'm like, what did I do? And so I went back through. I should have been paying a little bit closer attention, but what I realized is that I had literally almost doubled my spending on groceries that I expect for the month of March, because I was thinking that there could be shortages. My phone is telling me I have low power. Okay. So I was thinking that there would be shortages, so I was just buying food and sticking it in the freezer because I didn't know if I wasn't going to be able to find it in a couple weeks with all the stuff going on. And it turned out that I'd bought twice as much food as I had budgeted for, literally. I came in way under in April this month, so it wound up evening out because I was able to eat off the stuff in the freezer all month, so I didn't have to spend much this month. But what does that say? I didn't have confidence that I would still be able to get access to the same kinds of food, in the same quantity in a month or two, because I didn't know, what kind of shortages might come up. So you wind up saying, well, let me just get a couple things of chicken wings, throw them in the freezer, or whatever. So ultimately, consumer confidence, or the lack thereof, is going to affect purchasing decisions. Now, if you expect that the economy is going to be bad, then you're going to start worrying about whether you're going to be able to keep your job, typically. You're going to start worrying about whether, you're not going to get raises that you thought you were going to get, or get dividends on your stock that you thought you were going to get. So what will happen is people will therefore be a lot more thoughtful about whether to go get a new sofa or something like that they feel like they can put off or delay for a period of time. So as a result, if you run a furniture store and all of America is putting off buying a sofa because they're concerned they might get laid off, well, you're just not going to get much in the way of sales. And so if you have enough people expecting the economy to be bad, it can actually kind of cause it to happen. If you have enough people kind of thinking things are going to be okay, it can actually kind of cause it to happen. It's kind of this weird kind of self-fulfilling prophecy thing that begins to happen. So how do you know where you are in the cycle? There's three types of indicator of where you are in the cycle. So leading indicators are measures of economic performance that usually change 6 to 9 months before the GDP goes up. So when the economy is starting to turn around, these are the first things that start to happen. There are new building permits, orders for capital and consumer goods, consumer expectations start to get better, average manufacturing work week, stock prices, the money supply. All these things, if they start to tick upward for a fairly extended period of time, for a few times in a row, that's normally a sign that you're moving in towards an economic recovery. Coincident indicators are things that shift alongside real GDP, and those are things like employment, sales volume, and personal income. And then finally, lagging indicators are things that kind of come around after GDP has grown. So they happen kind of at the tail end of economic recovery. So length of unemployment is an example of that. Consumer credit to personal income ratio is an example of that. If you have the economy starts to improve but people are in credit card debt, it's going to be a little while after the economy's turned around before that ratio is going to shift. And the business cycle, we had a real boom period during the 50s and parts of the 60s. We had a real extended bust in the 70s up until about 82. Then things went really high until about 91. And we had another little crash for only a couple years. And then we had from like 92 to 01, we had the longest growth period we've ever had. Then, we started to have, then we had the terrible crash that started in 07. It was kind of slow for 4 or 5 years. And then we started to tick back up and then skyrocketed, and then COVID happened, and now we'll see how long it takes us to get out of this mess. So, but the business cycle is just a fact of life. One last thing. So, how do you kind of help stimulate economic growth? The main way to cause economic growth is productivity and wise use of resources. Before Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, there was all this thought, how do you grow the economy? You keep more gold than the other countries have gold or whatever. And Adam Smith came in and said, no. The way that you increase productivity is by making better use of your natural resources. He was a big fan of free international trade because he thought that enabled a country to really focus on what they did well. And so, why try to have everything here when you can focus on the things you do well and maximize your profit and productivity that way. So there's a couple things that cause economic growth or help in this sense of productivity or being, which the best way to measure productivity too, I should say too, population growth influences economic growth because if the population is growing up, the GDP is going to go up. But if the population growth is faster than the GDP growth, then your book uses the example of it's like if you've got 10 people coming to a potluck and everyone brings one dish, and then you have another party where 100 people are coming to a potluck and everyone brings one dish, you're actually going to have the same amount of food because you've got 90 more dishes, you've got 90 more people eating. But if you say everyone brings 2 dishes, well, now you've got, 100 people came and they brought 200 dishes. Well, that's an increase in GDP per capita. So real GDP per capita is when they divide the real GDP by the population in order to figure out how much productivity, the average person has. And this is a way to kind of help measure the means of growth. So what are some things that determine economic growth? Well, first is natural resources. If you have natural resources, that's a huge advantage. However, there are some economies that do pretty well without having a ton of natural resources. Japan is one. On the other hand, India has a lot of natural resources and for years didn't really know what to do with them. Now they're starting to grow economically. One thing, if your economy is over dependent on one natural resource, you can be in for a hurting. So a country like Saudi Arabia is having some problems right now because their economy runs on one thing, oil. And that's the one thing that nobody needs right now is oil. And they never thought that they would ever come. The second factor is human resources. That's the labor input. That's the size of the labor force multiplied by the length of the work week. So how many people do you have to be able to work? Because if you have, one of the problems America is going to have right now is just we don't have a lot of work input because so many people have been laid off because they don't have money to be paid. So, work input is the amount of hours that the people of the country are working toward productivity. The third factor is capital, which we've already discussed capital before. Capital deepening is a phrase that refers to an increase of the capital to labor ratio. And then the fourth thing is technology and innovation. We've talked about how certain technologies over time, have increased productive capacity significantly, whether, that's the development of robots that can produce more than, many industrial workers would have produced or things like that. Of course, we've talked about kind of the downsides of that as well for the economy. So, one last note, an economist that you might want to be aware of on page 374 is a fellow by the name of Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was the father of the idea of overpopulation, and that there would be a natural limitation on economic growth because the population of the world is going to grow exponentially. The productivity can't keep up with it, and people are going to eventually have to deal with more scarcity. And it's kind of the economics of Thanos, right? And you hear a lot of people talk about overpopulation being an economic issue. The problem is Malthus has been proven wrong. It's not necessarily a stain on him as a scholar per se because things change, but his numbers were completely wrong. First off, population growth has not kept pace with what he expected by any means. Secondarily, we've figured out ways to dramatically increase things like our food production, even with many fewer people working in agriculture because of the development of new technologies and stuff like that. And so our capacity for productivity has increased alongside, a slowing of the rate of population growth. And now we've actually at the point, but for whatever reason, so many people have absorbed this thesis from Malthus that's badly outdated, that we've got overpopulation, that a lot of the countries of the world are dealing with an underpopulation problem, because if a couple only has 2 children, they've not actually increased the population of the world, they've replaced themselves. So if you actually are going to contribute to a net growth in population, you have to have at least 3 children as a couple. So, a lot of countries of the world have moved to being an average of less than 2 children, and so because of that, a lot of economies are strained to grow because there's actually not enough population growth to keep track of what they need, especially countries that, this is especially a factor with Social Security systems, because Social Security was built on the idea, when we put in Social Security in the 30s, there's this idea that, everyone's going to have, 6, 8 children who are going to be able to pay into the program so we can go ahead and borrow, Grandpa can go ahead and borrow from his, 64 grandchildren right now, and it's okay because by the time they're getting paid, when they put into Social Security, they'll have, those 64 grandchildren will have produced 256 great-great-grandchildren. Well, that's not what happened because people stopped having so many kids. Because having kids used to be economically helpful. It was more hands on the farm. And now it's, economically more difficult. And then, you had some just cultural changes as well accompanying that. So, in actuality, Malthus was really wrong. And one of the big problems facing the world today is not enough people actually having enough children. So if you still kind of just picked up from TV and movies or whatever this idea that we're badly overpopulated or whatever, know that has been pretty much a discredited theory. All right, so we just covered a whole chapter in one lesson. We're going to be doing a lot of that because we're not going to quite finish this book, but I wanted to make sure we get all the highlights, and we only got 2 weeks to do it. So y'all take care and enjoy your stretch run.